Black Americans have been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus pandemic, and this has been compounded by the tragic deaths of Black men and women's lives who've been cut short at the hands of police as well as vigilantes. Well, talking about this, we want to talk about trauma and stress and the real effects it has on a person's health, physically as well as mentally. Sharing more details on this, I am joined by the founder of the Association for Trauma Outreach and Prevention, ATOP, Meaningful World, Dr. Ani Kalayjian. And we thank you so much, Dr. Ani, for being with us.
Thank you so much, Daren Jaime. This is really incredibly timely program, and I really appreciate your efforts to bring in racial justice.
Yeah, we talk about this, and we talk about the fact that trauma really exists in the African American community when it comes to the violence that we see, the unarmed deaths, and the lack of justice. So share with us a little bit about what you perceive as trauma in this current climate.
Yes. Now, a lot of the racial trauma is just similar to any classic post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, you may say to me, it's not post, is ongoing. Yes. We don't even have a word for it scientifically, Pastor Jaime, because we are used to having PTSD, but which started in the 70s when our Vietnam veterans started coming home. First, it was called shell shock and then some other words, but then they realized that these people needed support, mental health, because they were traumatized. So how do we know they're traumatized? They were having flashbacks. They were having nightmares. They wanted to avoid things that resembled the incident. But when it comes to African Americans, how do you avoid work? How do you avoid university, college? Because the slurs, racial slurs and racial difficult, challenging the stereotypes can happen in the street, in the market, in the school, and at work. You can't avoid work. And that's why we see a lot of attrition and a lot of people are not doing their best in their work or even dropping from a school. I've had several college students that I had to counsel to have them go back to school because they didn't want to be the minority in the school and they didn't want to hear. Some of them is unheard, kind of insinuating an attitude, looking kind of demeaning looks, and other ways that we shun African Americans and have this racial trauma that is ongoing. It's not
Right.
post, although we call it post-traumatic stress disorder because we don't have any other words for ongoing chronic situation. Now,
So let me go here and talk about racial trauma for a minute, because when we talk about it, it's real, it's
yes.
evident, it's out there. But what are the signs of racial trauma?
I mentioned, I'll review a little bit, the hypervigilance, like almost borderline suspicious, losing trust in themselves and others, and scaringly, the world. They could lose trust in the world and the very people that are trying to help them. That's called horizontal trauma. They may individually experience it. They may have it generationally transmitted to them because that's what the research shows now. Before, it was hearsay that it is passed on to 7 generations. Now we have DNA proof that it's passed on to 14 generations. So we have the hypervigilance, we have the suspiciousness, we have the constant insecurity about our own abilities in pursuing our career, or for example, in university situations, is full professorship. It's very few African Americans achieve full professorship and tenure as compared to the white ones, and also less women as the white men as well. So we can see it in every aspect of our life. Fear of the white authority figures, fear of engaging in companies that are run by white people. So there is also difficulty concentrating in your work or in your schoolwork or just everyday self-care responsibilities. And this is exactly the signs of post-traumatic stress disorder. And we experience it on 5 different levels. Individual, when people have individual experience of this racial slur or demeaning attitude, etc. We have collective trauma because it is affecting us, both whites and African Americans. It is the generational trauma. It's passed on from our parents, African American families' parents. And it is horizontal. Now, you would say, what is horizontal? Horizontal violence is internalizing the oppressor's, white person's attitude about African Americans. And then, because this is the scientific explanation, let me go, have patience with me. So the oppression and racism is top down, system down to the people. And the frustration is building from the gut up to the heart and then goes up, but there's nowhere to go because the racism continues. Maybe it's less, maybe it's subtle, but it continues, is very alive and continues. So what happens to this frustration that is up to here? It blows horizontally. And who's next to me? Who's next to me? The people that love me, the people that I care for, but unconsciously I'm putting them down. This is also called in the South, the crab in the bucket syndrome. You've seen a group of crabs in a bucket, one tries to come up, second one pulls it down, third one tries to come up, fourth one pulls it down. At the end, no one gets out. And then they turn around, they say, look, Black on Black violence. And they blame the victim rather than say, okay, let's look at horizontal violence, because unconsciously they're engaging in this phenomenon.
And also, we talk about, this racism component. Racism has far-reaching effects. You talk about the mental component, you talk about the physical component, but also that, that emotional component. And all of that can sometimes lead to PTSD. There's so many people who are walking around here right now with, racial PTSD.
Yes. It's just like any other trauma. Racial trauma is just, and even more because it's continuous. Usually trauma starts, there's a war, there's a genocide, and then it ends. And a hurricane or earthquake, and then it ends. But the racial trauma is yet unique and complex because it is continuing 600 years and still in some way alive. And that is what we need to address. You mentioned the physical. Yes, on the physical level, African Americans have more heart attacks and high blood pressure, etc. It's not just their lifestyles, which is also system directly result of the system. It's also because trauma that is not resolved, transformed, it's going to go into the body. And it's going to, one by one, destroy your organs. Starts with thyroid, suppresses it, it goes to the heart and the lungs. The lungs don't expand. This is a research base. You can go to apa.org and see some of this. And then the heart, and then the digestive system, and then the muscles. So it has an effect on every part of our body. And then the really scary part, it doesn't let us have empathy for the others who are suffering. We have seen this, and the research shows those people who have trauma and they haven't healed, they will definitely have weaker empathy and not understanding not to others who are going through similar. And they start with one-upmanship. Oh, What is that you went through? Oh, it was just a racial slur. Oh, you should see what I had to go through. And they start comparing and creating this hierarchy of suffering, which is very destructive because
Right.
empathy heals, but this kind of comparison, it separates us.
So I want to get to the place of dealing with the trauma because so many people walk with it, live with it. Some people don't even recognize that they have it, but it's there.
I'm glad.
And and it bleeds out is what I'm getting to. And
Yes.
as it bleeds out, the problem is that if it doesn't get checked, I know one of the things that you say is if the trauma isn't transferred, it's passed on.
Right. If it's transformed, then it stops there at the tracks. But if it's not healed, it's going to be transferred to other people. There is a saying that we have, watch out, because when you bleed from the trauma, you're going to bleed on people who did not even cause it. Your own brother and sister, you bleed on them and you traumatize them over again. But you said something really nice about the unseen, and you said something about the not being able to even acknowledge. You know how many people, African American people, that in my scientific circles, I have approached and said, "Let's work together." Then I'm talking about Pastor Jaime. 30 years ago, when I first completed my doctorate at Columbia University. And they looked at me and they said, "What trauma, racism? I'm born here. I'm not a child of slaves. So I don't have any trauma. I'm an American. I'm not even African American." So there was a lot of denial in the scientific community, the handful of African Americans that we find in psychology and other scientific academic circles, they were denying it. And I'm so glad that you're starting to talk about this in a very scientific and a very disciplined manner. And I hope the audience will read and will listen and will be in touch with us, because we have monthly workshops on this.
There's a lot of racial trauma that goes on. There's a lot of people who are really trying to not get over racial trauma, but really get through it. And we'll talk about that. I want to talk, if you could introduce our audience a little bit to the United Nations, and they have the SDG. And I want to talk about for a moment, and we'll bring the slide in, about how we are actually promoting the SDG.
So it has 17 goals, Pastor Jaime, and the ones that are specifically related to racial justice are one, which is education, two is health, and four is equity, and five, equality, and 10, which is for peace building, and 16 as well for peaceful nations, and 17 partnering, just like we're doing now, Meaningful World and yourself. We're partnering to bring this education to the general public, because these scientific research have been locked in academic circles and professional APA or other organizations. And you are doing a wonderful job bringing this to the people, because this is how we're going to heal. We're going to empathize with one another, validate each other's pain and suffering, and lift one another up through certain steps of healing that we have, the 7 steps.
Yeah. And I want to take the time to talk a little bit about you for a minute, because you also have your book out, and Forget Me Not. And I want to let our viewers have an opportunity to find out more about your book and the work.
Thank you so much for that. And this is the book, The 7 Steps for Healing Our Body, Mind, Spirit, and Mother Earth. One other problem that we are having is our climate unconsciousness about the climate. So we started the activities and films on YouTube, bringing in the importance of climate and the Mother Earth, respecting, nurturing, and planting trees and peace and forgiveness gardens. So the book is almost like a handbook or a workbook to help everyone to go through the healing process, especially geared to trauma. Anyone who has had trauma or is working with somebody with a trauma can use the book as a tool. We have handouts at the end of each chapter for further work, and we have questions after each chapter for you to start your own journey and in a way autobiography. So it's a wonderful workbook, and I hope that online everybody can get it. It's like $2.99, something like that. The Kindle books, etc. So it's very inexpensive. We did it purposefully so a lot of people will be able to use it as a healing model.
Dr. Annie Kalayjian, it's great working with you. It's great having you on the show. Want to thank you for being with us. And of course, we put the information throughout the course of this interview on how people could actually get in touch with you. Thank you so much for being with us here on the Social Justice.
I like to conclude with our wonderful motto at Meaningful World: when one helps another, both become stronger. So let's help each other and get through and help people heal from the trauma of racism.
Dr. Annie Kalayjian, our guest here on the Social Justice Forums. Yes, let's get together and heal. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Kalayjian. All right. Well, listen, we got more show. Don't want you to go anywhere. Stay with us. We'll continue on the Social Justice Forums.